Hello, and welcome to Let's Get Lit. In today's video, we're going to go over stave 1 of Charles Dickens' classic, A Christmas Carol. So, if you have your fuzzy blankets ready, your nice good hot cup of cocoa, and let's dive right into this classic Christmas tale. Alright, so this story starts out with our narrator telling us that Marley is dead. He is deader than a doornail. Our author doesn't know why the expression is doornail. He would think a coffin nail would make more sense, but nonetheless, he lets us know that Marley is dead. The narrator then tells us that a man named Scrooge signs Marley's death certificate. The narrator also tells us that Scrooge was Marley's business partner. The narrator then goes on to tell us all about Scrooge and what kind of a man he is. Scrooge is an old curmudgeon of a man who is so tight-fisted with money, so mean and so spiteful. The narrator tells us that even on the day of Marley's death, Scrooge continued to work to make a profit. The narrator tells us that nobody likes Scrooge. No one stopped Scrooge to ask him how he was, no one asked him if they would come see him, no beggar would ask him for money, no children would ask him what time of day it was, and even the beggar's dog would walk away from him and not interact. But the narrator tells us that Scrooge didn't really care and that he liked it that no one talked to him. The narrator sets this scene out for us. It's a cold Christmas Eve day and the clock has just struck 3 o'clock in the afternoon. At this time, the sun was almost already set. Thick, dense fog covered every inch of the city. The narrator notes that even with all the crowded houses and courts, the fog was so thick that you could barely make out the place next to you. The narrator tells us that Scrooge was sitting in his counting house, counting money, and that one of his employees was seated not too far away working as well. Then all of a sudden, Scrooge's nephew comes into the counting house. The nephew wishes Scrooge a Merry Christmas and God save you, to which Scrooge replies, "Humbug." The nephew says, "Surely you can't mean that, Uncle Scrooge," but Scrooge reassures him that he does. The nephew and Scrooge have a conversation about Christmas, and we learn that the nephew has come to ask Scrooge to stop by tomorrow for Christmas dinner with him and his family. To which Scrooge declines the offer and tells him that he's being stupid, that there really isn't a reason to be celebrating Christmas, and that if he had it his way, everyone would be working on Christmas. Through this conversation, Scrooge gets upset and at one point lets his nephew know that he thinks every idiot who says Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled in his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. Scrooge tells his nephew that nothing ever has derived from Christmas that's benefited anyone. It has never done anything to help him prosper in his life. The nephew retorts by saying that Christmas has done good for him. It's the one time of year where everybody opens their heart and are more caring and giving and loving towards one another. The one time of year where man recognizes fellow man and stops to give them a warm greeting. Once they got into the small heated conversation about dinner, Scrooge brings up why the nephew even got married in the first place. The nephew responds as because he was in love, and Scrooge tells his nephew that there is nothing more ridiculous in this world than getting married, not even Christmas. Scrooge then quickly tries to end the conversation, and then the nephew says that there is no good that's ever come from a conversation to be left on a sour note. He wishes Scrooge a Merry Christmas, then walks over to Scrooge's employee and wishes him a Merry Christmas as well. The employee wishes him a Merry Christmas back. As the employee lets the nephew out of the office, he accidentally lets in 2 other people. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. These gentlemen were going around town asking for donations for the poor. They had asked whom they were addressing, whether it was Mr. Marley or Mr. Scrooge, to which Scrooge replied that it was him and that Marley had been dead 7 years already. When the men were asking for donations, Scrooge asked if there was not still prisons open, or union houses, or any other place that people could go to for a handout. The gentleman said these establishments were still open, and then Scrooge says, "Then why do you need my money?" They said that because there is an abundance of the poor, they are trying to gather provisions to help buy meat and drink and warmth for a lot of people who so badly need it. These men also say that a lot of people would rather die than go to the places that were not going to provide anything. Scrooge then says, well, if they would rather die, then they should die, and decrease the surplus population. Scrooge then says that it's none of his business, and that it's not enough business for one man to worry about his own, that they shouldn't interfere with others. Scrooge then shushes them away out of the office. The narrator notes that as Scrooge is pushing the 2 men out of his office, he can see the streets all around, from the lamplighters lighting the lights to everyone rushing about the streets. Scrooge sees all sorts of men and women and children rushing about as he was trying to close the door. He could hear carolers coming by and trying to sing "God Rest You Merry Gentlemen," but as soon as they were trying to sing to him, he shut the door in their faces. The time comes for them to close the office, and Scrooge mentions to his coworker that he guesses he wants the day off tomorrow. The coworker says yes, if it's quite convenient. Scrooge replies that it isn't convenient and that he doesn't agree to pay a day's wage for no work. The coworker says that it's only once a year, and Scrooge says that that's a poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. But Scrooge does give him a whole day off, but tells him to be early the next day, which the man agrees and heads out. The narrator notes that Scrooge closes the office and goes off to take dinner in his usual tavern. After Scrooge has read all the newspapers, he then makes his way home with his banker's book. The narrator describes where Scrooge lives and that it was owned by Marley, but when Marley passed away, Scrooge inherited it. It was a very old house, and most of the rooms inside of the house were rented out except for a few. Once Scrooge makes it to the front door, he reaches towards the knocker of the door. When he looks down, he sees the face of his old partner Marley staring back up at him. It was not just a shadow or a resemblance, it was exactly his face staring back up at Scrooge. This frightened Scrooge, and he quickly looked away, but then looked back at the door. When he looked back at the door, it had its regular knocker. Scrooge opens the door, and as he's opening the door, he looks back again to see if Marley's face is staring at him, but it's not. So he slammed the door, and sound can be heard throughout the house. Scrooge then lights a candle and begins to check through the entire house to make sure that nobody's in there. The entire house is very dark because Scrooge likes the darkness, and it's cheap. He checks by the sofa, under the bed, and the closet, everywhere he can think to make sure that nobody is in his house. He even double locks the door, which he normally doesn't do, just to make sure he's safe. Once he is satisfied, he changes into his nightgown and cap and slippers and sits down by the fire that is very dimly lit. As he was sitting in his chair by the fireplace, he looks at the fireplace that is designed with many depictions of the scripture. But as he's looking at the fireplace, all he can see is Marley's face in all of the images. This startles Scrooge, and he gets up and walks around the room. Once he has calmed down, he goes back to his chair and sits. As he is seated, he looks up and he can see the old bell that is no longer in use. This bell was used to communicate between different floors. As Scrooge starts to look up at the bell, he notices the bell begins to move and sway, and soon all of the bells started to ring out very loudly throughout the house. It may have only lasted for half a minute to a minute, but it felt like an hour to Scrooge. And in an instant, as the bells rang together, they all ended at the same time. Once everything was quiet, he could then hear a booming sound of the floors below. It sounded as if someone were dragging chains across the floor. It started in the wine cellar and moved its way up through the house, and he could hear it going all the way up the stairs towards him. And it began getting closer and closer. And as it got closer, he noticed a figure coming through the door, and it looked just like Marley. This terrifies Scrooge, but he doesn't want to appear scared to the spirit, so instead he remains calm and cold. Scrooge actually asks the spirit, "What do you want with me?" To which Marley's voice says much. Scrooge asks, "Who are you?" and Marley replies, "Who I was." The spirit responds that he was Jacob Marley. Scrooge asks the spirit if he can sit. He does this to see if he can make a fool of the ghost. Just then, when the ghost sits, he is terrified by what he sees. The ghost says that you don't believe in me, to which Scrooge agrees. Scrooge asks, "What evidence do you have that you are beyond my senses?" The ghost asks, "Why do you doubt your senses?" Scrooge says, because little things affect him, whether it be undigested bit of beef or mustard or a crumb of cheese or a fragment of undone potato, there should be a logical way to explain what is going on. Scrooge then tries to give an example with a toothpick about things that aren't really there, but this just makes Marley angry. Marley then raises up a frightful cry and shakes all of his chains and makes a startling noise. Scrooge holds on tight to his chair so he doesn't fall over. The ghost begins to then take off his chains, and the buildup in terror in Scrooge has him immediately on his knees asking for mercy. Scrooge asks, "Why you trouble me?" Marley then asks, "Do you believe in me or not?" Scrooge says he does. "Why do spirits walk the earth, and why do you come to me?" Marley says it's required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad amongst his fellow men, and travel far and wide, and if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world. Scrooge says that he is fettered, and asks why. Marley says that he wears the chains he forged in life, that Marley made them, link by link, yard by yard, and that he girded it of his own free will, and now he was doomed to wear them. The ghost lets Scrooge know that he's also making a coil for himself that's just as long and just as strong as Marley's. Scrooge asks Marley to comfort him, but the ghost replies that he doesn't have any comfort. He then tells Scrooge about his traveling, that because he never traveled far in life, he was now traveling quite a great deal in death, and none of it was good. Scrooge asked if he'd been traveling since his death the whole 7 years, to which the ghost says yes, the entire time, with no rest, no peace, and incessant torture of remorse. Scrooge said you might have to go over a great quantity of ground in 7 years. This upsets the ghost, and he again makes a large and loud terrible noise into the night. Scrooge says, "But you're a good man of business, Jacob." The ghost cries out loudly at the word business, and he replies that mankind was his business. The common welfare was his business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence, all of these things were his business. And throughout life, all he ever did was look upon the ground and not at the people around him or up to the heavens. The ghost cries out, "Hear me. My time is nearly gone." Scrooge says that he will, but don't be hard upon him. Don't be flowery. The ghost tells Scrooge that he is here tonight to warn him that he has a chance and hope of escaping the fate that Marley has. A chance and hope of his own procuring Ebenezer. Scrooge thanks him. The ghost says that he will be haunted by 3 spirits. Scrooge asks if that is the chance that he has mentioned. The ghost says it is, and Scrooge says that he thinks he'd rather not. The ghost says without their visits, Ebenezer cannot hope to shun the path he has tread. The ghost says to expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1. Ebenezer asks, couldn't he just take them all at once and have it over with? The ghost says, expect the second on the next night at the same hour, the third upon the next night, when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. The ghost says that he has to leave and that for his own sake he should remember what has passed between them. Marley then wraps his bandages back on him and begins to head towards the window. As Marley gets closer and closer to the window opens fully. Ebenezer tries to follow, but Marley stops him, says not to come any closer. Once Marley goes out the window, Ebenezer rushes to it, can see a whole crew of spirits who has chains upon them, and they were wailing into the night. Scrooge even mentions that he knows one of the spirits who was passed on earlier. As he got a good look at all the spirits, they all fade away into mist. Scrooge then rushes back to the door to check and see if it had indeed been locked. And it was. He tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable. And from the emotions he had undergone, were the fatigues of the day, or the glimpse into the spirit world, or whatever it may be, he rushed to the bed without even undressing and fell asleep upon an instant. This concludes the first stave of A Christmas Carol. Tune in next time as we go over the second stave of this classic story. Have a great day, and as always, stay lit.